Hello and welcome to the Maritime Impact Podcast. I'm your host Eirik Nyhus, Director Environment for Maritime at DNV. We are well into 2024 at the time of this recording and have now experienced the first few months of shipping being part of the EU emissions trading system. While I will have more to say about that in a later episode, today I thought it timely to revisit another piece of EU regulation that is close at hand, the FuelEU Maritime regulation. Long-time listeners will have heard me talk about this topic in previous episodes, but the sense I'm getting from the shipping community is that many have not really been thinking much about it. In simple terms, getting ready for the ETS has consumed a lot of bandwidth. So here it is, a reminder that what you are seeing now maybe isn't the light at the end of the ETS tunnel, but rather the headlights of the FuelEU Maritime train hurtling towards you. And on that rather ominous note, let's get on to the show. We hope you enjoy the episode. FuelEU Maritime, FEM from now on, is the next regulatory step from the EU, taking effect from 1st of January 2025. FEM applies requirements to the greenhouse gas footprint of the energy used on board ships with, at least initially, the same vessel coverage as the ETS, namely cargo and passenger vessels above 5,000 gross tons. It also applies a coverage approach similar to what is known from the ETS. For voyages that go into or out of the EU and the EEA, half of the energy used is considered in scope. However, for voyages between EU and EEA ports, as well as within the same ports, the scope is 100% of the energy used. The regulation takes into account electricity received as well as giving credit to vessels with wind-assisted propulsion systems. But for most ships it will, at least initially, be all about the fuel used on board. FEM imposes requirements to the well-to-wake greenhouse gas footprint of the fuel used, covering not only CO2, but also methane and N2O, tightening in 5 yearly increments. It starts in 2025 with a 2% reduction requirement from a defined baseline, tightening to an 80% reduction in 2050. What this means is that at its core, the FuelEU Maritime is not about how much fuel you burn, but rather about what you burn, also taking into account the greenhouse gas production footprint for any given fuel. This means that traditional energy efficiency measures do not really help with compliance, though they do alleviate the economic impact of the actions necessary to attain compliance. At its core, the FEM is designed to shift maritime fuel consumption away from conventional fossil fuels towards increasingly green alternatives. A significant part of the regulation is therefore a calculation methodology and numerical values needed to calculate the greenhouse gas intensity for any given fuel used. You then use these numbers when you calculate the actual total yearly greenhouse gas intensity footprint for the ship itself. It goes beyond the scope of this pod to dive into the technical details, but suffice it to say that some aspects are defined in the FEM itself, while others come from the Renewable Energy Directive and its revisions. A second part of the legislation is the requirement to passenger and container vessels to connect to shore power for port stays exceeding 2 hours. This becomes effective only in 2030, and while there are numerous exemption clauses in the regulations, the costs of non-compliance will be significant. In the broadest sense, the FEM regulation has sharp teeth in that 2 consecutive years of non-compliance can lead to ships being banned from EU waters, and in certain cases, detention until compliance is achieved. In most cases, this will likely be through paying an imposed fine. Finally, it's worth noting that at least conceptually, it forms a basis for the EU's greenhouse gas fuel intensity proposal to the IMO, though the technical details differ. The implication is that once the IMO's greenhouse gas fuel intensity standard enters into force, we can expect to have 2 similar but not identical regulations applying for voyages into, out of, and within the EU and the EEA. So how can ship operators go about ensuring they are compliant? Looking at the design of the regulation, one of the striking features is that ships operating in liquid fossil fuels will be non-compliant from day one. When it comes to fossil fuels, the initial 2% reduction requirement to the greenhouse gas intensity is in fact only met by certain LNG-powered ships, depending on their engine technology. So given that you are expected to be immediately non-compliant beginning of 2025, what are your options? The first one is of course to start using alternative fuels. The obvious go-to solution is to use a small amount of sustainable biofuel, which will be sufficient to achieve a 2% footprint reduction. However, even the pretty limited demand generated by the 2% requirement is likely to go well beyond what is available to shipping, at least initially. And other alternative fuels are certainly not more abundant yet, even though there are regulatory and investment support efforts underway in the EU to increase the supply of such fuels. The second option is to work with what is called the compliance balance. In essence, this is the difference between required greenhouse gas intensity and actual greenhouse gas intensity multiplied by the FEM-relevant energy use, giving a balance measured in tons CO2 equivalent. If you're undercompliant, you can remedy this negative balance by pooling with other overcompliant ships to attain overall pool compliance. Given the flexibility built into the pooling mechanism, this essentially turns compliance units into tradable commodities, where pool membership can be extended to undercompliant ships for an appropriate consideration. The compliance balance will be managed through mandatory ship-specific accounts that will be set up in the existing EU Thetis system. This is the EU-run database that companies have been using for MRV-related purposes since 2018. In addition to managing pooling, the Thetis accounts can be used to handle banking of excess compliance units for use in later years, or for the borrowing of compliance units from next year. If you do borrow from your own next year balance, you will get hit with a 10% interest. As an example, if you borrow 500 tons CO2 equivalent from 2026 in order to meet your 2025 obligations, you will then start 2026 with a negative compliance balance of 550 tons CO2 equivalent. It is also possible to become compliant by paying a penalty based on a negative compliance balance. While this is designed to be dissuasive, it is a legitimate compliance strategy and may be attractive to some, at least initially when the availability of alternative fuels can be expected to be insufficient and costs are considerably higher than fossil fuels. The penalty presently sits at €2,400 per ton of VLSFO equivalent and is applied by converting a year-end negative compliance balance in CO2 equivalents to VLSFO equivalents and then multiplying by €2,400 per ton. It's important to note that if paying the penalty is your chosen compliance strategy, an additional 10% gets added on for every consecutive year of penalty payment. The penalty level also remains subject to adjustment and will be re-evaluated at the end of 2024. When running the numbers and comparing the costs of the ETS and the penalty mechanism of the FEM, the ETS hits much harder initially. Cost parity between the two can be expected around 2035, and after that, the FEM penalties start to significantly outweigh the ETS costs. This is because the penalty scales with the compliance gap, and if you do not move to lower intensity fuels, the compliance gaps will increase every 5 years as the requirements tighten. With this rough overview of the regulation itself, what are some of the challenges and complexities that we see? The first one I want to mention goes back to who is the legally responsible party. As you may recall, the European Commission, or EC, has landed on the registered owner having legal responsibility by default, both for the ETS and the MRV. This can be delegated to the ISM company if mutually agreed. However, for the FEM, the EC has decided that the legally responsible company shall be the ISM company. Full stop. This misalignment between MRV and ETS on the one hand, and the FEM on the other, will cause challenges for the information flow between owners and the ISM company, especially as the MRV will not only underpin the ETS, but also partially the FEM. And when you start thinking about the complex interplay between owners, managers, and charterers, and throw pooling arrangements and the monetary value of compliance units into the mix, you will see that existing contractual frameworks between parties will need additional clauses governing the commercial implications of FuelEU Maritime. Similar to what the ETS is already doing to emissions monitoring, this will also drive a need for operators to have full control over what fuel you're using, when you're using it, and where you are when doing so. Verified, close to real-time data will be necessary to satisfy the commercial requirements and contractual obligations. Then we have the issue of the first relevant compliance date. While the regulation itself kicks in from 1st of January 2025, the actual first default compliance date is 31st August 2024. That's this year. This is the date by which the FEM monitoring plans needs to be submitted to the verifier, and it's only a few months out. While there is a certain flexibility here in that the regulation also states that the ship should submit it no later than 2 months after its first call at an EU port, it's advisable for ships in the EU to get it done by end August. So what does a monitoring plan look like? And is a template available? Well, almost, but not quite. The draft monitoring plan is presently on hearing, and I would expect the final version to be published in June. That being said, I also would suggest that the draft is very close to what the final version will look like and can be the basis for starting the necessary work. There are a number of other design and implementation issues to be addressed, and the Commission is working on these, and industry is providing input through bodies such as the EC runs European Sustainable Shipping Forum. Some of these issues are cross-cutting for the MRV, the ETS, and the FEM, such as the definition of offshore ships, which may be included in the FEM pending a 2027 review, and consideration of how to include onboard carbon capture. Others are unique to each individual piece of legislation. But the big 500-pound gorilla is of course a question of fuel availability. And note that this is not exclusively an EU question. Ships sailing into or out of the EU will not necessarily have been bunkering in the EU. This means that the question of what fuel to use to become FEM compliant becomes one of global availability of adequate alternative fuels, and these need to be certified to a standard that the EU accepts. Throw into the mix the parallel regulatory processes at the IMO on developing a global greenhouse gas fuel intensity standard for ships, discussed in the previous episode of this pod, by the way. Add to this the continuous debate on fuel certification and emission values under the LCA framework, you'll start to realize that this is not a straightforward matter. So when will the necessary volumes of alternative fuels satisfying the FEM requirements be available? I have my doubts that this will happen within the first few years, to be honest, but I'm pretty confident that the demand signal sent by the FEM, along with the ETS and also with the incoming IMO greenhouse gas regulations, is going to lead to a significant uptick in supply eventually. Simply put, the incentives for fuel producers to invest in increased supply are starting to become clear. So to the key takeaways. First, FuelEU Maritime is coming sooner than you may think. For many, August 31st this year will be the first relevant compliance date, with 1st January 2025 marking the start of data monitoring and reporting. Second, understand your compliance options: alternative fuels, working with compliance units, or paying the penalty. Third, examine the commercial implications of how legal responsibility differs from the ETS and how this interacts with commercial considerations around pooling and compliance units. And fourth and last, same as for the ETS, get control of your fuel usage and emissions data. Granular, verified data is becoming necessary to manage the commercial aspects, including satisfying contractual obligations. In reality, the commercial requirements to data granularity will go well beyond what is needed to demonstrate legal compliance to the EU. And here, I want to make you all aware that DNV's future revisions of Emissions Connect will allow you to control the business impact of FuelEU Maritime alongside those of the EU ETS. You've been listening to the Maritime Impact Podcast from DNV with me, Eirik Nyhus. This was a summary of the state of play for the FuelEU Maritime regulation. Later this season, we will discuss the implementation progress of the EU ETS, along with lessons learned, as we continue to provide insight into shipping's decarbonization journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to give us a rating or review. Thank you for listening.